My name is Arthur Hayes, I'm 61, and for months, I lived a lie. I believed my daughter, Chloe, was marrying the man of her dreams, a respectful partner who shared her vision for the future. That illusion shattered the morning I heard my future son-in-law, Julian Thorne, casually declare in the back seat of my Sprinter van, "Once we're married, the museum won't be her first priority." His words, spoken as we drove down I-85, were an accidental trigger that changed everything. How could I have been so blind? In a terrifying rush, I uncovered a secret job offer in Miami, a hidden prenup, and his plan to publicly announce a cross-country move without her knowledge. All of it, just days before the wedding. He was still adjusting his tie, a confident smirk on his face, utterly unaware his perfectly constructed world was about to collapse. Before I tell you what happened when they saw me, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. The morning I heard my future son-in-law say, "Once we're married, the museum won't be her first priority," I nearly missed a red light on I-85. For a second, I thought I'd heard him wrong. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Julian Thorne was sitting in the back seat of my dark gray Mercedes Sprinter van, looking out the window like he just commented on the weather. Not like he'd casually described changing my daughter's entire life. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I kept my eyes on the road. Kept my mouth shut. And listened. That moment changed everything. My name is Arthur Hayes. I'm 61 years old, and I've lived in Atlanta, Georgia my entire life. For 37 years, I worked as a long-haul truck driver. Long days, early mornings, hard work. The kind of work where nobody cares about your opinions if the shipment isn't delivered on time. I retired 2 years ago. At least that was the plan. Turns out, retirement sounded a lot more exciting than it actually was. After 6 months of mowing the lawn, reorganizing my garage, and driving my wife Eleanor crazy by constantly asking what she wanted to do, I needed something productive. Not because we needed money. I just needed a reason to leave the house. That's how I ended up driving for a high-end furniture delivery company based outside Alpharetta, Georgia. Mostly residential clients. Interior designers, wealthy homeowners, people who appreciated careful handling and preferred having the same driver whenever possible. The schedule suited me. A few mornings each week, a few long-distance runs, some local deliveries. Nothing complicated. The funny thing is, Julian became one of my regular passengers before I realized who he was. At first, he was just another guy in a bespoke suit. Early 30s. Expensive watch. Always checking emails. Always talking on the phone. Then one morning, I heard him say a familiar name. Chloe. My daughter. I nearly looked into the mirror so hard, I would have driven off the road. Over the next few minutes, pieces started falling into place. The voice. The age. The company. The stories. It was him. Julian Thorne. My daughter's fiancé. The man she'd be marrying in 4 months. The strange part? He had no idea who I was. To be fair, there were reasons. A few months earlier, I'd started extensive dental implant work. My dentist had recommended I wear a mask during recovery because I was self-conscious about the temporary bridge work. I also wore company-issued sunglasses in a black cap. Most clients barely glanced at me. Julian certainly didn't. Even when he'd come to family dinners before, he wasn't exactly focused on me. Not because he was rude, at least not openly. He was one of those people who walked into a room and naturally made everything about himself. He remembered stories that made him look good. He remembered accomplishments. He remembered compliments. Other people? Not so much. At first, I actually found the situation entertaining. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I'd pick up my future son-in-law and drive him downtown. Meanwhile, He sat 3 foot behind me without the slightest clue he was talking to his future father-in-law. I told Eleanor about it one evening. She nearly choked on her sweet tea. "You're kidding." "I wish." "You mean he doesn't recognize you?" "Not even a little." She laughed so hard tears formed in her eyes. "Arthur, that's terrible." "You're smiling." "Because it's funny." And honestly, it was. At least in the beginning. The more time I spent around Julian though, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because he was openly cruel. That would have been easier. Instead, it was little things. The way he spoke to restaurant servers. The way he interrupted people. The way every conversation somehow drifted back to him. One morning, another executive shared the ride. The man mentioned his daughter's debate tournament. Julian immediately redirected the conversation toward his own college leadership roles. The other guy barely finished 2 sentences. Julian never noticed. Or maybe he didn't care. I kept telling myself none of that meant he was a bad person. Plenty of successful people were self-centered. Plenty matured over time. Chloe loved him. That mattered. My daughter wasn't naive. She worked as an archivist at a local museum. She spent her days cataloging historical documents and preserving cultural heritage. She was smart, kind, independent. After a rough relationship in her 20s, she'd become much more careful about who she trusted. Which was why I tried not to judge Julian too quickly. Then came that Tuesday morning. The morning everything shifted. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as we headed east. Traffic moved slowly. Julian's phone rang. He answered immediately. "Yeah," he said. A pause. Then a laugh. A long laugh. The kind that made my stomach tighten. "No, seriously. Once we're married, the museum won't be her first priority." Silence filled the van. I stared straight ahead. Maybe there was context I wasn't hearing. Maybe he was joking. Maybe then he continued. "I know her. She trusts me." My jaw clenched. The voice on the other end said something I couldn't hear. Julian chuckled again. "Look, right now she's still attached to Atlanta. Friends, family, work, all that stuff." A pause. Then the sentence that made my blood run cold. "The farther she is from Atlanta, the easier everything becomes." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. Recognition. Because I'd heard words like that before. Years ago. From another man who wanted control more than partnership. A man Chloe had eventually left. Julian kept talking casually. Like he was discussing weekend plans. Like he wasn't describing how he intended to reshape someone else's life. By the time we reached his office building, my stomach was in knots. He ended the call. Gathered his briefcase. Opened the door. Then leaned back inside for a second. "See you Thursday." "Yeah, have a good day," I said. My voice sounded normal. Somehow. He stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the building. I sat there for several seconds. The engine idling. Rain sliding down the windshield. Trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I'd only heard part of the conversation. Then another thought hit me. Julian hadn't said our plans. He hadn't said Chloe and I decided. He hadn't said we. Everything he described had been his decision. His timeline. His future. His strategy. And for the first time, I wondered whether the man my daughter was preparing to marry saw her as a partner at all or something else entirely. I didn't tell Chloe what I'd heard. Not that day. Not that week, either. For 3 days, I carried it around like a stone in my pocket. Every time my phone rang and I saw her name, I almost said something. Every time she texted about wedding plans, I nearly typed it out. Then I'd stop, delete everything, and tell myself to slow down. After 35 years of marriage, Eleanor knew exactly when something was bothering me. The following Friday evening, we were sitting on our back patio. Nothing fancy. Just two old wrought iron patio chairs, a couple glasses of sweet tea, and the sound of tree frogs coming from the trees behind our fence. She looked over at me. "You still thinking about Julian?" I sighed. "Maybe I misunderstood. You don't sound convinced." "I keep replaying it." Eleanor set her glass down. "What exactly bothers you?" I stared into the yard. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. She nodded. That was exactly it. There hadn't been any hesitation. No uncertainty. No discussion. Julian had spoken like Chloe's future was already settled. Like she was a passenger in a car he was driving. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Then pay attention," she finally said. "What?" "Pay attention before you start accusing anyone of anything." That was good advice. Probably better than I deserved. Because if I'm being honest, part of me already wanted to hate him. Not because of anything he'd done. Because I was scared. And fear can make a father dangerous. So I decided to watch. Nothing more. Just watch. The next week I picked Julian up outside his condo near the city's upscale district in Alpharetta. Same routine. Bespoke suit. Coffee in hand. Phone already pressed against his ear. He slid into the back seat. "Marcus, listen to me," he said before I'd even pulled away. Apparently, I wasn't worth greeting. I drove. He talked. The farther we went, the more interesting the conversation became. I already accepted the offer. A pause. Then no, Chloe doesn't know yet. I glanced at the mirror. Julian was staring out the side window. Relaxed. Completely unaware. The offer. What offer? A few minutes later, I got my answer. Miami is perfect. My stomach tightened. Miami. Florida. Over 600 miles from Atlanta. Another pause. Then once we're married, moving will make sense. I nearly missed my exit. Not because of anger. Because Chloe had never mentioned Miami. Not once. That Sunday, she came over for dinner. Like she often did. She brought a caprese salad. Eleanor made pot roast. The Atlanta Braves game played quietly on television in the family room. Normal. Comfortable. The kind of evening I'd always hoped my daughter would still want after she became an adult. At one point, Chloe helped me clear plates from the table. I kept my voice casual. "How's wedding planning?" She smiled. "Busy. I bet. We finally booked the caterer." "That's good." A few seconds passed. Then I asked, "So, what happens after the wedding?" "What do you mean? You staying in Atlanta?" She laughed. "Of course." That answer hit me harder than I expected. I tried not to react. "Never thought about moving?" She shook her head. "My whole life is here." Then she smiled. "Besides, Julian loves Georgia." I nearly dropped a dinner plate. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Eleanor rolled over. "Still awake?" "Yep." "You believe her?" "Absolutely." "Then maybe Julian hasn't told her." Neither of us said anything after that. Because we both knew what it meant if he hadn't. The following week I started noticing patterns. Not dramatic things. Small things. The kind most people miss. Julian constantly referred to decisions as if they'd already been made. He'd say things like we're buying. We're moving. We're doing this. But never we've discussed or we've decided. One Tuesday morning, he spent nearly 20 minutes on the phone with a real estate agent. He wasn't looking at homes in Georgia. He was discussing neighborhoods in Florida. School districts. Property taxes. Commute times. The whole thing. Yet every time Chloe visited our house, she talked about the future as if she expected to stay right where she was. Two completely different realities. And only one of them knew it. The situation started eating at me. I found myself distracted. Short-tempered. One afternoon, I snapped at Eleanor over absolutely nothing. 5 minutes later, I apologized. She simply looked at me and said, "You need facts, Arthur." She was right. Facts, not assumptions, not fears. Facts. A few days later I got them. At least the first real piece. Julian climbed into the van looking irritated. Not angry, frustrated. Like someone whose plans weren't moving quickly enough. He immediately called someone. Speakerphone. Again. The man had the privacy instincts of a golden retriever. Did the attorney finish it? Julian asked. A pause. Then he nodded. Good. More silence. Then, I don't care if she reads every page. He laughed. A cold little laugh. The prenup is written exactly how I wanted it. I felt every muscle in my back tighten. Prenup. Chloe had never mentioned a prenup. Not once. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she didn't. I kept listening. The whole point is protecting future assets. Pause. Exactly. Another pause. Then the sentence that stayed with me. If things don't work out, I won't be walking away with nothing. When he ended the call, my hands felt damp against the steering wheel. I drove another 10 minutes before dropping him off. The moment he left, I pulled into a gas station parking lot. Not because I needed gas, because I needed air. I sat there staring through the windshield, trying to process what I just heard. Moving plans. Hidden job offers. A prenup Chloe had never mentioned. Maybe none of it was illegal. Maybe none of it was even immoral. But every piece pointed in the same direction. Julian wasn't building a future with my daughter. He was building one around her. And for the first time I began wondering whether the wedding itself was only part of a larger plan. A plan Chloe hadn't been invited to help create. For about a week after hearing Julian mention the prenup, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started doubting myself. Not because the facts disappeared, because they were getting harder to interpret. If Julian had been openly cheating on Chloe, things would have been simple. If he'd been stealing money or lying about his identity, that would have been simple, too. But this? This was murkier, more uncomfortable. Because on the surface, Julian looked like a man planning for his future. The problem was that every future plan seemed to belong to him alone. One rainy Wednesday morning, I picked him up outside his condo a little after 7 o'clock. The sky was gray. The sidewalks were wet. Julian climbed into the back seat carrying a leather portfolio. He seemed unusually cheerful. As we headed toward downtown Atlanta, he called Chloe. I expected another conversation that would raise my blood pressure. Instead, I heard something entirely different. His voice softened. "Hey, sweetheart." I hadn't heard that version of him before. They talked about dinner plans, a movie, something funny that had happened at her museum. Chloe laughed. Julian laughed. And for a moment, he sounded genuinely happy. When the call ended, I sat there confused. That was the problem. Julian wasn't pretending. At least not completely. He cared about her. I was sure of it. Which somehow made everything worse. Because people expect villains to be obvious. Real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes people hurt others while believing they're doing the right thing. That realization stayed with me all day. That evening, I told Eleanor. She listened quietly while folding laundry in our bedroom. When I finished, she looked up. So, maybe he loves her. I think he does. Then, what's the problem? I sat down on the edge of the bed. The problem is he thinks he knows what's best for her. Eleanor stopped folding. Now, she understood. We both did. Because we'd seen it before. Not in marriage. In parenting. It's easy to confuse love with control. Easy to start believing your decisions are automatically better than someone else's. Especially when you're convinced you're helping. Julian wasn't treating Chloe like a partner. He was treating her like a project. And projects don't get a vote. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Not through spying. Not through secret investigations. Through pure arrogance. Julian spent nearly 40 minutes on the phone during one ride. The conversation sounded like a strategy meeting. Retirement accounts. Investment structures. Joint assets. Tax advantages. Most of it went over my head. But certain parts didn't. At one point, he said, once Chloe leaves archiving, we can simplify everything. I nearly looked into the mirror. Leaves archiving? Not if, when. A few minutes later, 2 incomes aren't necessary. Then, she worries too much about independence. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Chloe loved her work. She wasn't getting rich doing it. Museum archivists rarely do. But she cared deeply about those artifacts. She talked about them constantly. The discoveries. The connections. The little historical victories. Julian talked about her career like it was a hobby she'd eventually outgrow. That weekend, Chloe stopped by again. This time alone. Eleanor was running errands. For about an hour it was just the two of us sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. I kept telling myself not to push. Not to pry. Then I failed. How's the wedding budget looking? She smiled. Pretty good. You keeping separate accounts? The smile faded slightly. Dad. What? She laughed. That was random. I shrugged. Just asking. Chloe studied me for a second. Too long. Then she asked, is this about Julian? My stomach dropped. I tried to play it off. Apparently badly. Because she immediately crossed her arms. What is going on with you lately? Nothing. Dad. I'm just being careful. About what? I hesitated. Big mistake. Chloe saw it instantly. Her expression changed. Not angry. Defensive. You don't trust him. I opened my mouth. Then closed it. Because there wasn't a good answer. She shook her head. I knew it. Chloe. No. Her voice cracked slightly. He's been nothing but good to me. I stared down at my coffee. Maybe. The second the word left my mouth I regretted it. Chloe pushed her chair back. Not dramatically. Just enough. You know what hurts? I looked up. She looked exhausted. Every time something good happens in my life, you start waiting for it to fall apart. That one landed. Hard. Because there was some truth in it. Not all of it. But enough. The conversation ended badly. Worse than badly. By the time she left, neither of us felt heard. For the next 12 days, she barely answered my calls. Those were some of the longest days I'd had in years. Eleanor tried to reassure me. Didn't help much. Every morning, I kept driving Julian. Every evening, I wondered if I'd already ruined my relationship with my daughter. Then, just when I was considering giving up entirely, fate handed me something I couldn't ignore. Julian got into the van on a Thursday afternoon looking excited, almost giddy. The second he sat down, he called someone. "Everything's booked." Pause. Then, a laugh. "No, she still doesn't know." I felt my pulse quicken. The call continued, and within 30 seconds, I understood why. Julian had reserved the grand ballroom at the St. Regis Atlanta. A large, future vision, gala for his hotel chain. Nearly 100 guests. Family. Friends. Co-workers. Everyone important in their lives. Then came the part that made my stomach turn. Julian planned to use the event to announce their move to Miami. Publicly. In front of everyone. Without discussing it with Chloe first. He described it as a surprise. A gift. A grand romantic gesture. I gripped the steering wheel harder because I finally understood something. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about cheating. It wasn't even about deception. Julian genuinely believed he had the right to make life-changing decisions for someone else. And if I was going to stop this wedding, I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof Chloe couldn't ignore. As Julian stepped out of the van that afternoon, he smiled. For the first time all week, completely confident, completely certain, and completely unaware that his own plan had just given me the opportunity I'd been searching for. For the first time since this whole mess started, I had something concrete. Not proof that Julian was a criminal. Not proof that he was cheating. Something far more useful. A pattern. A pattern of making major decisions for Chloe without ever treating her like an equal partner. The challenge was figuring out what to do with it. Because simply telling her wasn't going to work. I'd already tried pushing. That conversation at my kitchen table had proved exactly how badly that could backfire. The harder I pushed, the more she defended him. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. If someone had criticized Eleanor before we got married, I probably would have done the same thing. People don't like being told they're wrong about someone they love. They have to discover it themselves. A few days later, I met an old friend for breakfast. His name was Detective Miller. Retired Atlanta police detective. We'd known each other almost 30 years. The kind of friend who doesn't say much unless it matters. We met at a little diner off Peachtree Road. Same place we'd been meeting once a month since retirement. Miller listened while I explained everything. The rides. The phone calls. The hidden job offer. The Miami announcement. The prenup. When I finished, he took a sip of coffee. "You're looking for a smoking gun. Maybe. You won't find one." That wasn't the answer I wanted. "What do you mean?" Miller shrugged. "Because guys like this usually aren't criminals." I frowned. "So, what are they?" "They're people who think they're smarter than everyone else." That hit closer to home than I liked. Miller leaned forward. "You don't need proof Julian is evil." "I'm listening." "You need proof Chloe isn't getting the full story." Simple. Practical. Exactly the kind of advice Miller always gave. As I drove home, I realized he was right. This wasn't about destroying Julian. It was about exposing the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. The next few weeks became a balancing act. Every morning I drive Julian downtown. Every evening I debate whether I was doing the right thing. Some days I felt justified. Other days I felt like a sneaky old man spying on his daughter's fiancé. I hated that feeling. More than once I considered quitting the driving job altogether. Then Julian would climb into the back seat and remind me why I couldn't. One Tuesday morning he spent 20 minutes talking about Chloe's future. Not with Chloe. With a colleague. She'll thank me eventually. I remember that sentence clearly. Because people who say things like that usually aren't listening to anyone except themselves. A few minutes later he added, honestly, she worries too much about being independent. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Chloe had spent her entire adult life being independent. She bought her own car. Paid off her student loans. Worked through graduate school. Julian talked about independence like it was some temporary phase she'd eventually outgrow. The more he talked, the clearer everything became. He wasn't trying to hurt her. That would have been easier to expose. He genuinely believed his plans were better than hers. And that belief made him dangerous. One morning something happened that almost made me lose my composure. Julian climbed into the van unusually cheerful. As we headed toward downtown, he suddenly started talking to me. Actually talking. For the first time in months. Married? He asked. I almost laughed. The man had spent half a year sitting behind me and only now noticed I existed. 35 years. Wow. He nodded. Any advice? For a second I considered telling him exactly what I thought. Instead I said, listen more than you talk. He chuckled. That's it. Worked for me. Julian smiled politely. Then spent the next 15 minutes talking about himself. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. When I told Eleanor that story later, she nearly fell off the couch. You're kidding. I wish. After 6 months. 6 months. She shook her head. Arthur, if this wasn't so serious, it'd be hilarious. The truth was there were moments that were funny. Julian treated me like furniture. Like part of the vehicle. He'd discuss business deals, vacation plans, arguments, private conversations, all in front of the one person he should have been careful around. His future father-in-law. The irony would have been unbelievable if I hadn't lived it. As the Future Vision gala approached, I began quietly gathering documentation. Nothing illegal. Nothing complicated. Just facts. I verified the Miami job offer, confirmed the ballroom reservation, tracked timelines, compared dates, collected emails Chloe had shown us over the months. By themselves, none of those things meant much. Together they told a story. A story Julian never intended anyone to see. Meanwhile, Chloe and I remained distant. Not completely estranged, but different. Careful, polite. Every conversation felt like walking across thin ice. That hurt more than I expected. One evening, Eleanor found me sitting alone in the garage. I wasn't doing anything. Just sitting, thinking. She walked over and leaned against the workbench. You miss her? I nodded. Yeah. Eleanor was quiet. Then she said, whatever happens next, make sure you're doing it for Chloe. I am. No. She shook her head gently. Make sure you're not doing it because you're angry. That stopped me cold. Because the truth was, I was angry. Not just at Julian, at myself. For not knowing sooner. For letting things get this far. For potentially losing my daughter's trust. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder, then went back inside. And I sat there for another 20 minutes thinking about what she'd said. The next morning, Julian got into the van carrying a garment bag. He looked excited. Nervous, too. The Future Vision gala was less than 24 hours away. As we approached his office, he glanced up from his phone. Big day tomorrow. That's what I hear. He grinned. Biggest day of my life so far. I kept my eyes on the road. I hope it goes well. Oh, it will. The confidence in his voice was absolute. Then he laughed. You know my fiancé has no idea what's coming. My grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. No. She didn't. But neither did he. When we reached the curb, Julian opened the door, then paused. For some reason, he looked directly at me. Really looked. Maybe for the first time. Not enough to recognize me. Just enough to acknowledge I was another human being. Thanks, Arthur. The sound of my own name coming from him felt strange. I nodded. You're welcome. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, straightened his jacket, and headed toward the office building. Tomorrow he planned to unveil his perfect future. Tomorrow I planned to let Chloe see exactly who had designed it. The Future Vision Gala was held on a Saturday evening at the St. Regis, Atlanta. A warm June night. Clear skies. Perfect weather. The kind of evening people remember for all the right reasons. Or at least that was the plan. Eleanor and I arrived a little before 6 o'clock. The parking lot was already filling up. Inside the grand ballroom looked beautiful. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, soft lighting. A string quartet played near the entrance. Someone had spent a lot of money putting the whole thing together. Chloe looked happy. That was the hardest part. When we walked in, she came straight over and hugged us. For a moment she was 10 years old again. The same smile. The same warmth. The same trust. And I almost lost my nerve. Almost. Because as much as I wanted to protect her from pain, I couldn't protect her from reality. Not anymore. The evening started normally. People mingled. Servers carried trays of appetizers. Guests laughed and shared stories. Julian moved through the room like a politician working a campaign event, shaking hands, making jokes, collecting compliments. Several times I caught him glancing toward the small stage near the front of the ballroom. Waiting. Preparing. Building toward his big moment. Around 7:30, everyone began taking their seats. The room settled. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations faded. Julian stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass. The crowd applauded. Chloe stood beside him. Smiling. Completely unaware. Julian thanked everyone for coming. Then he launched into a polished speech. The man was good. I'd give him that. He talked about family. Commitment. Building a future together. He thanked Chloe. Thanked both families. Thanked his coworkers. People nodded along. A few guests even dabbed their eyes. Then he reached the part he'd been waiting for. His surprise. I've always believed life rewards bold decisions. He said. The room grew quiet. Julian smiled at Chloe. I wanted tonight to be unforgettable. Chloe laughed softly. What did you do? A few people chuckled. Julian turned back toward the crowd. Then announced it. Chloe and I are excited to begin our next chapter together in Miami, Florida. Applause erupted instantly. At first. Then it started fading. Because Chloe wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't moving. She looked confused. Genuinely confused. Julian noticed. His smile wavered. Just slightly. Enough for me to see it. Chloe leaned closer. What are you talking about? The microphone picked it up. The room became very still. Julian laughed nervously. The move. What move? A few guests exchanged glances. Julian tried again. The job opportunity. Chloe stared at him. Then came 4 words that changed the entire evening. What job opportunity? Silence. Absolute silence. You could have heard someone drop a spoon. Julian looked around the room. For the first time all night, he seemed unsure of himself. That was my moment. I stood. Slowly. No dramatic speech. No shouting. No scene. Just a 61-year-old father standing beside a banquet table. Julian looked toward me. Then looked again. This time longer. Much longer. I watched recognition begin forming behind his eyes. Not fully. Just enough. Like a puzzle piece sliding into place. The voice. The face. The name. His expression changed. Arthur. I nodded. Yeah. His face lost color. A few guests looked confused. Chloe looked even more confused. Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I spoke calmly. Chloe, before anyone makes another announcement, I think there are a few questions worth asking. Nobody interrupted. Not even Julian. Questions about what? Chloe asked quietly. I looked at her. Not him. Always her. When did Julian tell you he accepted a job in Miami? Chloe turned toward Julian. He said nothing. That answer spoke loudly enough. I continued. When did he tell you he'd already researched neighborhoods? No response. When did he tell you he'd started planning your relocation? Still nothing. The room felt frozen. Julian finally stepped forward. Arthur, this isn't the place. I looked at him. Really? That landed harder I intended. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Chloe folded her arms. Her voice was calm now. Too calm. When were you planning to tell me? Julian swallowed. I was going to. When? No answer. The silence stretched. Julian tried changing directions. It was supposed to be a surprise. Chloe shook her head. A surprise vacation is a surprise. The room remained completely still. She continued. Moving me across the country isn't. I could see panic beginning to appear behind Julian's eyes. The confident speaker from 15 minutes earlier was disappearing. Fast. I reached into my jacket pocket and handed Chloe several printed documents. Nothing secret. Nothing illegal. Copies of information I'd verified over the previous month. Job offer details. Housing research. Planning timelines. Dates. Facts. Chloe looked through them slowly. Page after page. Each one telling the same story. A future designed without her involvement. Julian started talking. Trying to explain. Trying to justify. Trying to reframe. But the more he spoke, the worse it became. Because every explanation revealed the same thing. He hadn't asked. He hadn't discussed. He had decided. Finally, Chloe looked up. There were tears in her eyes. But not the kind I'd expected. Not heartbreak. Clarity. The painful kind. You kept calling it our future. Julian opened his mouth. She didn't let him speak. But every decision belonged to you. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Chloe slipped the engagement ring from her finger. Slowly. Carefully. She placed it in Julian's hand. The room seemed to stop breathing. I loved you. She said quietly. I know. Julian answered. For the first time all evening, he sounded sincere. Maybe he was. Chloe nodded. I believe that. Then she looked directly at him. But you never respected me. Those words hit harder than anything else that night. Because they were true. Julian wasn't a monster. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even pretending to love her. The problem was simpler. And sadder. He loved being in charge more than he loved being a partner. 10 minutes later he walked out alone. No shouting. No security. No dramatic ending. Just a man carrying the weight of his own choices. The weeks afterward weren't easy. Chloe was hurt. Embarrassed. Angry. Some of that anger landed on me. Fairly, if I'm being honest. Healing takes time. Trust does, too. But slowly things improved. 6 months later, she enrolled in a specialized art history program she'd been considering for years. She bought a small loft downtown Atlanta. Nothing fancy. Just hers. And for the first time in a long while, she seemed excited about the future again. One Sunday afternoon, she came over for dinner. Just like old times. As we cleaned dishes afterward, she looked at me and smiled. "You know, Dad." "What?" "You were annoying." I laughed. "Only annoying?" "Extremely annoying." "That's fair." She bumped my shoulder. Then added, "But thank you." That was enough. More than enough. Looking back, I've realized something. For most of my life, I thought protecting my daughter meant solving problems for her. It doesn't. Sometimes it means showing someone the truth and trusting them to decide what comes next. If you've ever faced a moment where telling the truth risked damaging a relationship, then you probably know how hard that choice can be. Sometimes it's worth it anyway. Thanks for listening to my story. Lessons from this story. Pay attention to subtle signs of disrespect and self-centeredness in relationships. Love can sometimes be confused with a desire for control over another person's life. Revealing difficult truths, even at personal cost, can be necessary for genuine trust and well-being. A true partnership is built on mutual respect, open communication, and shared decision-making.